They sent a car for me at 4 in the morning, Roman time. I was halfway through a 3-day seminar on hypothetical non-human semiotic structures, a subject the Vatican funded because it cost almost nothing and made them look forward-thinking. When a young Marine corporal appeared in my office doorway at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and told me I had 11 minutes to pack a bag. He did not tell me why. The reason was in the envelope he handed me, sealed with both a UN watermark and a Department of Defense classification stamp I had never seen used together. I read it in the car. Then I read it again on the military transport out of Ciampino. 11 years earlier, a coordinated international effort called Project Overture had transmitted a multilingual scientific greeting into deep space, a compressed package of mathematical constants, biological data, and a crude semiotic primer meant to establish shared reference with any intelligence capable of receiving it. The project had been my doctoral obsession. I had helped design the primer, the layer meant to teach a non-human mind how human meaning works. That primer included anatomical data, cell diagrams, organ maps, a complete index of Homo sapiens as a biological system, offered in good faith as proof that we were alive, complex, and worth talking to. At the time, no one had asked whether a body introduced as a sign might also be received as material. 19 hours before the corporal knocked on my door, something answered. The signal had been routed to a secure facility at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, an old army post on the Narrows, repurposed in the last decade as a joint UN-DoD signals intelligence site. I arrived to controlled chaos. 40-odd analysts, linguists, astrophysicists, and intelligence officers working in rotating shifts inside a converted gymnasium that still had basketball markings on the floor. Coffee stations, whiteboards dense with notation, people who had been awake too long, running on caffeine, and the strange, dull terror that comes when you realize the universe has noticed you. A Navy captain named Driscoll ran the floor. He walked me through what they had while 2 analysts pulled the signal's data layers onto a wall-mounted display behind him. The first layer was navigational. Stellar coordinates, trajectory data, and an arrival estimate. Approximately 93 days. Something was coming, and it had told us exactly when. The second layer was biological. An anatomical scan of Homo sapiens more detailed than anything in our own medical literature. Skeletal density maps, organ mass ratios, tissue hydration indexes, thermal conductivity per kilogram by body region. All of it extrapolated from the biological data we had included in the overture transmission, refined to a precision that should have been impossible from a sample that small. The analysts had verified the data against current medical databases. It was accurate to 4 decimal places. Whatever had received our greeting had studied our bodies with the attention of a surgeon preparing for a procedure. The third layer was the problem. It blended the anatomical data with thermal engineering specifications, heat tolerances, radiation absorption curves, structural load projections, and a dense symbolic register that no one on the floor could pass. The symbols were built from components of both earlier layers, as though whoever had constructed the message had taken our anatomy and their engineering and welded them into a single communicative system. 3 teams had spent 16 hours trying to separate the components. They could not, because the components were fused at the grammatical root. That was why they had called me. I spent the first 6 hours at a workstation in the gymnasium's far corner, cycling through the third layer's symbolic inventory with a legal pad and a stylus. My specialty, the one the Vatican had tolerated as an intellectual curiosity and the UN had kept on retainer as an unlikely contingency, was hypothetical xenosemiotic systems. How a non-human intelligence might structure meaning. Which grammatical assumptions might survive contact between species with no shared history, biology, or sensory world. I had spent 20 years thinking about this in the abstract, building theoretical frameworks and publishing papers that perhaps 60 people on Earth had read. The third layer was the test. By hour 4, I had the first structural breakthrough. The symbols were using anatomy, thermal engineering, and sacrifice as one vocabulary. The grammatical structure treated body, fuel, and offering as a single concept, three faces of the same semantic unit. A human body, in this language, was simultaneously thermal engineering material and sacred gift. Processing tissue for heat shielding was an act of devotion. There was no way to say body in this system without also saying fuel and offering. The concepts were fused too deeply for any clean translation to pry them apart. I called Driscoll over. I chose my phrasing carefully, but I could hear the shaking in my voice as I explained what the third layer was saying. The navigational data was an arrival notice. The biological data was a materials assessment. The third layer was a proposal. They needed human bodies, billions of them, raw material for a thermal shield around a distant world, and they were framing the request as a sacred obligation between species. Driscoll asked me to show him. I brought up the full third-layer display on the workstation and began the guided translation. As I decoded the structural grammar and fed the parameters back through the rendering software, the signal resolved into its visual payload. A rotating diagram filled the screen. Earth's population, all 8 billion, represented as abstracted anatomical units, sorted by mass, water content, bone density, and thermal yield into concentric bands around an unseen planetary body. Each band was color-coded by heat absorption capacity. The densest layers, built from the heaviest bodies, formed the inner shell. Lighter tissue mapped to the outer bands. Billions of human figures, stripped of name and face and nation, reduced to thermal architecture and arranged in a structure that looked like... I recognized the form because I had studied enough sacred architecture to see it. A cathedral built from the dead. A vast spherical reliquary, its walls made of processed human mass, wrapped around a world I could not see. The room went quiet behind me. I had not realized how many people had gathered. Within the hour, I gave my initial assessment to an emergency committee assembled by video link, representatives from the UN Secretary-General's office, 3 Security Council delegations, and a Pentagon liaison. I described the signal structure as precisely as I could. I explained the grammatical fusion. I used the term covenant proposal, because that was the closest English equivalent I had. The aliens were proposing mutual sacrifice for shared survival under a threat that endangered both species. Their language made no distinction between engineering requirement and sacred offering. In their grammar, the two were identical. A military liaison named Major Garrett, square-built, sharp-eyed, attached from Army intelligence as the committee's security advisor, asked me to repeat the part about the bodies. I repeated it. He asked whether I understood that I had just described a request for the industrialized slaughter of billions of human beings, and whether the word covenant was my professional assessment or my personal theology leaking into the translation. I told him the word was the closest English equivalent to a concept that existed in the alien grammar as a structural primitive, and that my job was to translate, not editorialize. He told me translation is always editorial. He was right. I knew it then. I know it better now. The second part of the signal arrived 6 hours later. Updated trajectory data. The fleet was closer than the initial estimate suggested. Once the astrophysics team refined its analysis, the navigational signatures indicated a formation of at least 300 vessels. 48 hours after I decoded the third layer, the fleet arrived. I watched it happen from the roof of Fort Hamilton, standing beside Driscoll and a dozen analysts who had come up for air and found they could not go back inside. The ships deployed above the night side of the planet in a coordinated unfolding that looked like flowers opening in the dark. Except the petals were structural, massive, and built for a purpose that became clear as the external arrays extended into operational configuration. Hooks. Continent-spanning gantries lined with hooked retrieval arms, each one scaled for cargo with shoulders, hips, and a spine. Cooling rack arrays spread outward from the ship's hulls in branching silver formations, thousands of racks per vessel, each rack partitioned into slots. Conveyor towers descended from the ventral surfaces like skeletal fingers reaching toward the planet, their interior channels wide enough to move bodies in continuous flow from surface to orbit. 319 ships. I counted them later from the official tracking data. Each one the color of old bone. Each one built with the functional clarity of a processing plant designed by an intelligence that had no reason to disguise its purpose. The next 72 hours compressed global panic, military mobilization, and diplomatic paralysis into one continuous emergency that I experienced mostly from inside the Fort Hamilton Gymnasium, now upgraded to a full UN Emergency Operations Center. The Security Council held continuous session. I was pulled into the chambers by secure link as the sole interpreter of the aliens' ongoing transmissions, which had shifted from navigational signal to operational liturgy, preparation instructions, intake protocols, yield calculations, all delivered in the same fused grammar, body as fuel as offering, every technical specification wrapped in sacred language, every sacred phrase carrying an engineering value. The council fractured along the line I had been dreading since I first decoded the signal. The confrontation faction, led by the American and Russian delegations, argued that the ships were slaughter infrastructure and their arrival constituted an act of war. The engagement faction, led by the European and several African delegations, argued that a military response against 300 ships of unknown capability was suicide, and that the only survivable path was negotiation. They asked for my assessment. I gave it honestly, through the lens of what I understood about the language, because the language was all I had. The alien communication structure treated the proposed harvest as mutual sacrifice under a shared existential threat. Their grammar implied a danger that endangered both species. I recommended verification. Board a ship, confirm their claims, and establish whether the threat they were fleeing was real before committing to war or compliance. The council voted to send an inspection delegation aboard the flagship. I was assigned as the primary interpreter. Major Garrett was assigned as security commander for the boarding team. A small complement of biologists, engineers, and diplomatic staff rounded out the group. We had 72 hours to prepare. Garrett found me in the signals room the night before departure. I was working on response phrases in the alien symbolic system, testing whether I could construct grammatically valid sentences in their language and speak their meaning back to them. He stood in the doorway and watched before he spoke. "You're learning to pray in their language," he said. "I'm learning to communicate." "Same thing," he said. "In their system, you told us those are the same thing." I looked down at the phrase I had just completed. It was a greeting formula. It was also a dedication for prepared tissue. Garrett stepped into the room but came no closer. For the first time since I had met him, he looked less angry than exhausted. The skin under his eyes had gone grey. His hand trembled once before he closed it around the strap of his vest. "We're drawing up strike plans," he said. "Every branch, every allied command, every platform we can move. Nobody thinks they work. That's the part no one is saying in session." He glanced toward the display, where the alien compounds rotated in clean, terrible symmetry. "So when you choose a word, Father, understand that some people will treat it as the only weapon we have left." He left. I kept working. The phrases came easier than they should have. The grammar had a beauty to it, a terrible, integrated beauty where every symbol carried its full weight and nothing was wasted. I admired it. I should not have admired it. But I am a translator and a priest, and when a language reveals a civilization, built around the conviction that sacrifice and survival are the same act, the same breath, the same word, it is difficult to encounter that without feeling something very close to awe. The shuttle docked with the flagship through a pressurized umbilical that attached to the alien hull, with a sound like a vast wet seal being compressed. Garrett's security detail went first. 4 soldiers in full tactical gear who stepped through the lock and found a corridor wide enough to drive a truck through, lit in flat, even, shadowless white. The light had no visible source. It came from the walls themselves, or from the surface treatment on the walls, and it erased every shadow. A working light, designed so that nothing on the processing floor could be hidden by angle or position. I followed Garrett through the lock and into the ship, and the scale hit me before anything else did. The corridor stretched ahead for what the rangefinder on Garrett's kit estimated at over a kilometer, straight and uninterrupted. The ceiling rose 12 meters above our heads. The floor was surfaced in a material like pale ceramic, slightly warm underfoot. The walls were inscribed. Dense, continuous text in the fused grammar ran in unbroken lines from floor to ceiling, covering every visible surface. I touched the nearest inscription and translated the compound beneath my fingers. A funerary formula, a dedication. Every surface of this corridor was a prayer for the dead it was built to process. We walked for 20 minutes before we reached the first processing bay. The bay was the size of an aircraft hangar, and it was running. The alien systems were active. Holographic projections filled the central space with rotating anatomical models of human bodies, each one tagged with thermal yield values, structural density ratings, tissue hydration indexes, and load-bearing calculations. The models were being sorted in real time into shield configurations, layered bands of processed human mass, arranged by thermal capacity, assembled into curved sections of a spherical shell that matched the structure I had seen in the decoded signal. A fragment of the shield, modelled at full resolution, hung in the air at the bay's centre. A wall of compressed human tissue, 2 meters thick, its internal architecture organised. Everybody had a place. Every kilogram served a calculated function. The biologists on our team stopped walking. One of them, Dr. Howard Nash, a forensic anatomist from Johns Hopkins, stood in front of the nearest projection and watched it cycle through a sorting sequence. I saw him try twice before he managed to speak. "They've already modelled us," he said. "Every body type, every age bracket. They know what we're worth per kilo." Garrett kept moving. He was cataloguing the bay's layout, exits, structural supports, power conduits, anything that might serve as a tactical reference if the diplomatic situation collapsed. His focus was professional and absolute. He looked at the projections only long enough to confirm they were projections. We passed through 3 more bays: intake and measurement, tissue separation, thermal compression, final assembly. Each bay added a new verb to the grammar I had been reading in abstraction. The equipment was vast and worn. These ships had been used before. The conveyor channels showed scoring from prior loads. The cooling racks carried residual discoloration that Nash identified as organic staining from a protein base close to human tissue, though measurably different. Near the 3rd bay, one of the engineers paused beside a secondary routing display and asked me to translate a set of destination markers. The terms were archaic and caste-specific. I could only render them approximately: hearth preserve, high lineage, seed sanctuary. The engineer asked if those were shield sections. I told him they appeared to be allocation categories. "For Earth?" "For something," I said. Garrett looked back at me. I could feel his attention, sharp and waiting, but the delegation was already moving, and I had no clean answer to give him. They had done this before, with their own kind. We reached the ceremonial bay at the ship's core after nearly 2 hours of walking. The space was smaller than the processing bays, but taller, a cylindrical chamber that rose 30 meters to a domed ceiling covered in the densest inscription work I had seen aboard the vessel. The text here was older, carved deeper, and written in a variant of the grammar that I could only partially follow. The words I could read were sacrificial formulas: names, yields, dedications, grief. The one I would learn to call Dothran was waiting for us at the chamber's centre. He was tall, nearly 3 meters, with a frame that suggested a bilateral skeletal plan adapted for higher gravity. 4 upper limbs, 2 of which appeared vestigial or ceremonial in function, folded against his torso in a posture I would later learn signified formal grief. His head was broad, flat-featured, dominated by 3 horizontal eye slits that tracked our group with a slow, continuous scanning motion. His skin, or what I could see of it, was grey-brown and finely textured, like old leather oiled and stretched too many times. His armour covered him from throat to ankle. Up close it was clearly organic. Compressed tissue, hardened through some process I did not understand, formed interlocking plates that carried visible traces of the bodies they had been built from. I could see the grain of bone in the shoulder plates. The chest piece had a layered structure that Nash would later confirm was consistent with laminated muscle fibre. The armour was plain, functional, unadorned. It was made from the dead with the same clarity the ship applied to everything. Material serving purpose, purpose serving survival, survival serving the sacred. I understood the statement before he spoke. The armour said, "We have done this to ourselves. We have already paid this price with our own flesh. We are asking you to share a cost we did not invent and cannot escape." He spoke, and the grammar I had been studying in signal fragments for 3 days came alive as sound for the first time. His voice produced tonal clusters that mapped to the symbolic compounds I knew from the transmission, each spoken unit carrying its triple load of anatomy, engineering, and sacred offering. I translated in near real time, haltingly at first, then with increasing confidence as the structural patterns locked into place. His formal gift to us was his name, Dothren. Then he gave us the name of his people, Thrari. In their grammar, the word carried undertones I could not compress into English: the grieving, the surviving, the ones who remain by carrying the dead. I rendered it as a proper noun, because anything else would have been interpretation. Only after that formal naming did Dothran tell us about the sterilizer wave, a phenomenon approaching from deep space, origin unknown, behavior observed across dozens of systems over centuries. It annihilated everything in its path, leaving a blank absence stripped of rubble, residual energy, and survival. The Thrari had watched it erase 17 inhabited worlds in 3 generations. They had tried every defense their science could produce. Their only partial, temporary success had been a biological thermal shield built from processed organic mass. Dense, layered, and constructed at a scale that required billions of bodies. The Thrari had harvested themselves first. Billions of their own people, processed and compressed into the thermal plating that Dothran now wore, and that lined the interior of every ship in the fleet. The shields still lacked the necessary mass. Their remaining population could not supply it. They had come to Earth because our bodies were thermally compatible, because we were numerous, and because we were close enough to reach before the wave arrived. The demand, when it came, was delivered in the full formal grammar, every syllable carrying its compound weight of body, fuel, and prayer. 4 billion human beings, harvested, processed, and assembled into thermal shielding within 60 days. In exchange, the completed shield, anchored around the Thrari homeworld at the wave's leading intercept, would cast a protected wake that included Earth during the wave's passage. I translated every word. Then I asked Dothran the question I had carried aboard the ship, the question that a linguist priest could not leave unasked. Why frame this as sacrifice? Why build a grammar that made slaughter and devotion inseparable? They had the ships, the technology, the obvious military superiority. They could take what they needed. Why ask? Dothran's answer came slowly, each tonal cluster placed with ritual care. In their understanding, a body processed without consent and sacred dedication produced inferior thermal yield. The physics of their shield technology, or their belief about those physics, held that coerced material degraded faster under the wave's energy than material that had been offered. Individual consent produced the strongest bond. Communal offering, declared by a legitimate authority over its own dead, was weaker but viable. Seized flesh, taken without accepted dedication, failed quickly and poisoned the layers around it. I translated this for Garrett, who was standing 2 meters behind me with a sidearm he had been told to leave holstered. He looked at me for a long time. "So the magic shield works better if we say yes," he said, "and if governments say yes for people who don't." I told him I was reporting what Dothran said, and that the underlying physics would need independent verification. "The underlying physics," Garrett repeated. He looked up at Dothran's armor, at the compressed tissue of Thrari dead formed into plates over a creature asking us to fill his ships with human corpses. "Father, you walked through 2 kilometers of slaughterhouse to get to this room. You saw what those bays are built to do, and you're standing here talking about underlying physics and sacred grammar." He stepped closer. His voice dropped. "You're going to write a report tonight. The Security Council is going to read it, and whatever word you use to describe what's happening on this ship, covenant, proposal, request, demand, that word is going to decide whether we fight or whether we start loading bodies. So I need you to understand something before you pick your vocabulary." He gestured at the chamber around us. At the inscribed walls, the ancient grief text, Dothran in his armor of the dead. "All of this is a sales pitch," he said. "The scripture, the armor, the ceremony, its packaging, and you're the only one here who can read the label." I told Garrett I understood his concern and that my report would be as accurate as I could make it. That night, aboard the shuttle back to Fort Hamilton, I wrote my preliminary assessment for the Security Council. I described the ship's processing infrastructure in precise technical language. I documented the thermal modeling systems, the shield configurations, the scale of the operation. I included Nash's biological findings and the engineering team's structural analysis. I noted the unexplained allocation markers in the routing display and recommended follow-up inspection, though at the time I treated them as unresolved terminology rather than evidence. And I described the Thrari communication system as what it was: a grammatically integrated structure in which sacrifice and survival were structurally identical. I wrote that Dothran's account was consistent across every level of the linguistic framework, that the grammar appeared to resist deception by design. I avoided the word covenant in the report. I used the phrase integrated sacrificial framework. I described the Thrari request as a survival proposal embedded in a sacred grammar that does not separate offering from engineering. I was precise. I was careful. I believed I was being neutral. Garrett read the report over my shoulder as I finished the final paragraph. He said nothing. He returned to his seat across the shuttle's cabin and buckled his harness for re-entry. I transmitted the report to the Security Council at 0300 Eastern Time. 14 hours later, I would learn that 3 delegations had already begun using the phrase sacred framework in their internal policy briefs. The language was doing what language always does. It was building a house for the decision to walk into. The Thrari offered to share their deep space observation data on the sterilizer wave. The Security Council accepted. Within 12 hours, the UN's orbital telescope array at Lagrange 2 had been redirected to the coordinates Dothran's delegation provided, and the astrophysics team at Fort Hamilton was processing the first images. I was in the operations center when Dr. Alan Marsh, the senior astrophysicist, put the composite image on the main display. The room had 30 people in it. Most of them stopped talking at the same time. A white wall was moving through deep space. The word wall is inadequate. It was a boundary, a termination line, advancing across a stellar field in clean vertical bands. Each band erased everything it touched. Stars that had been burning for billions of years vanished in sequence, replaced by a blank white absence with no emission spectrum, radiation signature, or gravitational residue. The bands moved in parallel, close enough that the whole structure looked like a curtain being drawn across a section of the sky. Some bands advanced faster than others, leaving a ragged leading edge that gave the wave a serrated quality, like a saw cutting through the dark. Marsh ran the observation data against Thrari records. The trajectory matched, the velocity matched, the arrival window, approximately 87 days, given the fleet's updated calculations, matched. "It's real," Marsh said. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis when the tests come back wrong, and there is nothing left to discuss about whether to run them again. That day, the Security Council's debate shifted from whether to engage with the fleet to what the terms of engagement would be. And because the Thrari communication system was the only channel through which terms could be discussed, I became the primary conduit for every proposal, counteroffer, demand, and ritual formula that passed between the species. Dothran delivered the formal demand again during my second visit to the flagship, 3 days after the wave's verification. He stood in the same inscribed chamber where we had first met, his compressed tissue armor catching the sourceless light. The number had not changed. The deadline had not changed. The room listening on the encrypted link had. The council had now seen the white wall moving through the stars. I translated the demand in real time. I translated the grief tones, the sacrificial honorifics, the compound words that made every reference to the dead an act of devotion. I was aware, in an abstract professional way, that my translations were shaping the emotional register in which the council received the information. The demand for 4 billion bodies, delivered in raw, tactical language, would have sounded like an ultimatum. Delivered through the sacred grammar, with the ritual context intact, it sounded like a terrible covenant. Both translations would have been accurate. I chose accuracy to the source language, which meant I chose the version that carried grief. The council heard grief. Grief is easier to negotiate with than aggression. Palik found me on the second visit, 40 minutes after Dothran's formal demand, in a corridor segment between the ceremonial bay and the docking umbilical. I was walking with 2 of Garrett's security detail, when one of them paused to inspect a junction panel. I continued several meters ahead and turned a corner into a shorter passage branching off the main corridor. A service baffle slid shut behind me, cutting off the soldiers' voices. Palik was there, pressed into an alcove behind a cooling conduit. He was damaged. The Thrari showed stress through tissue recession, a visible withdrawal of the soft structures around joints and skull, as though the body were consuming itself from the surface inward. Palik's recession was severe. The skin around his wrist joints had pulled back far enough to expose the underlying connective webbing, grey and dry and cracking at the edges. His skull ridges, smooth and flush in Dothran, stood out on Palik like exposed rebar. His 3 eye slits were wider than Dothran's, giving his face a raw, stripped look that I recognized as fear before I recognized him as a different individual. He spoke quickly, in a degraded version of the blended grammar, functional, stripped of ritual, almost crude compared to Dothran's polished ceremonial speech. I understood him, but the meaning came through bare, like a prayer with the music cut out. He told me his name. He told me he was a thermal engineer, one of the original designers of the shield calculations. He told me the 4 billion figure was a political fabrication. The true engineering requirement for a viable thermal shield around the Thrari homeworld was approximately 800 million human bodies. The surplus, the remaining 3.2 billion, had been added to the demand by the fleet's ruling caste to generate redundant shielding for secondary colonies, elite survival installations, and a reserve of culturally sacred Thrari remains that the general population had been told were already sacrificed, but were secretly preserved in the fleet's deep storage holds. The routing terms from the third bay returned to me. Hearth Preserve, High Lineage, Seed Sanctuary. Palik had helped design the original calculations. He had watched the leadership inflate them. He had said nothing, because silence meant his own homeworld would be protected, and objection meant exile from the fleet into the path of the wave. He pressed a data fragment into my hand. A compressed file in Thrari technical notation, small enough to fit on a chip the size of a fingernail. The original shield calculations, the uninflated numbers, the engineering proof that 4 billion was a lie built around a core of 800 million. Verify, he said. The word was one of the few that translated directly, a shared mathematical concept identical in both grammars. Then he was gone, back into the ship's interior, through an access hatch I had not seen open. I returned to the security detail. I closed my hand around the data chip. One of the soldiers asked if I had gotten lost. I told him the branching corridors were disorienting, and we continued to the docking umbilical. On the shuttle back, I told Garrett. I showed him the chip. I explained what Palik had claimed. Garrett looked at the chip in my palm. Then he looked at me. 800 million, he said. You're telling me the real price is 800 million, and they've been charging us 4 billion because their officers want extra padding for their estates. That is what the dissident claims. And the allocation markers? I don't know yet. Garrett leaned back against the shuttle bulkhead and shut his eyes for 1 second, long enough to hold himself still. When we land, this goes to the engineers, he said, and to the council. The data is in Thrari technical notation. It requires partial translation before any human engineer can evaluate it. Then, translate it. I will. But presenting unverified intelligence to the Security Council could be more damaging than waiting. Both of those things were true. Both of them were also convenient. The deeper truth, the one I could feel pressing against the inside of my ribs like a second heartbeat, was that if Palik's calculations were correct, then the grammar I had devoted 3 weeks of my life to mastering, the grammar I had told the Security Council could resist deception by design, had been carrying a lie the entire time. The sacred framework was intact, the engineering underneath it was corrupt, and I had been the one who told the world the framework and the engineering were inseparable. The shield test happened 9 days later. A cooperative team, human engineers and Thrari technicians working in parallel, under conditions that were themselves a negotiation, assembled a prototype shield fragment in orbit using human cadavers. The source material came from existing morgue reserves, donated bodies, and, in a decision that 3 member states pushed through the General Assembly over furious objection, the executed remains of death row prisoners from nations that volunteered their condemned. The legal formula mattered. The Thrari insisted on it. Donated bodies counted as individually offered. The prisoners' remains counted as communally designated by the states that claimed jurisdiction over them. Several human ethicists resigned from the advisory panel rather than certify the distinction. The certification was issued without them. The fragment was grown aboard a processing section of one of the smaller butcher ships. I was not present for the construction, but I saw the footage afterward. Human tissue, bone, muscle, fat, connective fiber, broken down, sorted by thermal density, compressed into laminated layers, and assembled into a curved section of shielding 2 meters deep and roughly the area of a city block. The finished fragment was transferred to a test frame at the second Lagrange point, suspended in vacuum, and oriented toward a captured microsample of the sterilizer wave's leading edge that a Thrari probe had harvested from a destroyed system. The fragment was dark, a deep black red, the color of dried blood compressed under enormous pressure. It was alive, in a way I had not expected. The processed tissue retained enough biological activity to maintain its own thermal regulation, adjusting its density in response to ambient energy. It contracted and expanded in slow, rhythmic waves, like a wall that was breathing. The test pulse hit the fragment at 0917 Greenwich time. The shield absorbed the energy. Its surface whitened under the wave's contact, layers of compressed human tissue flaring and degrading from the outside in, but the core held. For 11 seconds, the fragment resisted the same force that had been erasing stars. Then structural failure cascaded through the inner layers, and the fragment broke apart, dissolving into a spreading cloud of thermally exhausted organic residue. 11 seconds, against a force that erased stone, metal, and plasma on contact. The operations center absorbed the result in silence. The proof settled over the room like a door locking from the outside. The concept was viable. A full-scale shield, built to specification, might survive the wave's passage. The Security Council moved to close session within the hour. The timeline for a compliance vote accelerated from weeks to days. I was pulled into continuous translation duty, shuttling between Fort Hamilton and the flagship, carrying Dothran's terms to the Council and the Council's responses back to Dothran. And I had Palik's data chip sitting in a secure drawer in my quarters at Fort Hamilton, waiting for the engineering team to finish verification. The verification took 6 days. The Thrari notation system used physical constants calibrated differently from human values, unit conversions that required careful cross-referencing against the signal's original mathematical layer. I checked on the progress twice a day. I did not push for faster results. I told myself the data had to be clean before I could present it. I told myself partial verification would be worse than none. I told myself a responsible interpreter does not bring unconfirmed intelligence to a body making decisions about billions of lives. Each day I continued translating Dothran's ritual formulations for the Council. The grief tones, the sacrificial dedications, the compound phrases that made 4 billion sound like a threshold ordained by shared necessity. Each translation session built the frame higher. By the 4th day of closed deliberations, 5 delegations had drafted compliance proposals using the phrase covenant yield, a term I had constructed from the Thrari grammar to describe the demanded number in its ritual context. I had given them the vocabulary, and the vocabulary was giving them permission. The verification came back on the 6th day. Palik's calculations were internally coherent, consistent with known physics, and described a viable thermal shield at approximately 800 million human bodies. The surplus allocation in the 4 billion figure was tagged to coordinates that matched known positions of elite Thrari installations, secondary colonies, and deep storage preserves. The inflation was documented, quantified, and provable. I held the verified report for 14 hours. During those hours, I opened a secure briefing channel to the Council 4 separate times and closed it before recording. I drafted 2 memoranda and deleted both. In the first, I used the word fraud. In the second, I replaced it with discrepancy. Then I deleted that too. I sat at my workstation in the signals room and stared at the grammatical analysis I had built over 3 weeks. The beautiful, integrated, terrible system in which body and fuel and offering were one word, one concept, one truth. The prayer rope I kept in my pocket lay on the desk beside the report. I had taken it out without meaning to. I did not touch it. If I presented Palik's data, I would be proving that the system could carry a lie inside a truth, that the sacred grammar was a vehicle, and the vehicle had been loaded with political cargo, that my translation, my sacred framework, had been accurate about the language and catastrophically wrong about the number, and that accuracy about the language was what had made the wrong number survivable for the Council. I was still holding the report when Garrett arrived at my quarters at 0600 the next morning for a scheduled pre-departure briefing. We were due aboard the flagship in 4 hours for another contact session. He saw the verified report on my desk. He picked it up. He read it, standing in silence for about 2 minutes. Then he set it down. "When did this come back?" he asked. I told him. 14 hours, he said. "You've had verified proof that the number is inflated by a factor of 5, and you've been sitting on it for 14 hours. I began to explain the complexity of presenting intelligence to a body in the middle of... "You wanted it to be holy," Garrett said. "You wanted their language to be clean. You wanted the grammar that says body fuel prayer to be telling the truth all the way down, because if it was, then you found something real. The first real contact between human faith and alien faith. The first proof that sacrifice means the same thing across species. And now you have a piece of paper that says the faith was genuine and the numbers were rigged, and you can't stand it. So you sat here for 14 hours, hoping something would change." I had no answer that would have been honest, and also a defense. We did not go to the flagship that morning. We went to the Security Council. I presented Palik's verified data in emergency session. I was thorough. I laid out the original calculations, the inflation analysis, the coordinate tag showing surplus allocation to elite Thrari installations, and the estimated true engineering requirement of approximately 800 million bodies. I presented it as a correction and an opportunity. The shield could be built at a fraction of the cost the fleet was demanding. The Russian delegate asked whether the source could be trusted. I described Palik, his role, his deterioration, his shame, his disappearance after our last contact. I noted that Garrett's team had found Thrari security markers in the corridor where Palik and I had met, along with a fragmented message inscribed on the wall in degraded grammar. A single compound symbol. I had translated the image they sent me as, "The number is the sin." The American delegate asked whether 800 million was firm. I said the engineering supported it. The British delegate asked what the Thrari fleet's response would be if humanity offered 800 million instead of 4 billion. I said I did not know. The fleet's formal position was 4 billion. Challenging it with proof of inflation could provoke a reduction in demands. It could also provoke forced harvesting. I could not predict which. The council recessed for 6 hours. When it reconvened, the tone had changed in a direction I had not anticipated. The delegations that had built their compliance proposals around the concept of covenant yield did not abandon the framework when the number turned out to be inflated. They recalibrated it. The sacred framework had made the sacrifice legible as theology. Theology does not negotiate down to the minimum. Theology demands sufficiency, gravity, and weight. 800 million sounded like a transaction, a bargain, a discount on survival. The domestic political messaging built around sacred mutual sacrifice could not survive a reduction to the engineering minimum, because the engineering minimum sounded cheap. Several delegations argued independently for surplus as insurance. If Palik's numbers were optimistic, if the shield needed redundancy the original calculations had not accounted for, if the Thrari engineers had made errors Palik had not caught, the consequences of undershooting were extinction. Better to overshoot. Others argued that willingness, as Dothran had defined it, could not be manufactured at the scale required unless the sacrifice carried moral grandeur. A technical minimum would make the dead into material. A covenant yield would make them participants. I listened to diplomats discover that a larger number could be easier to sanctify than a smaller one. The Thrari fleet, confronted through back-channel communication with proof that its inflation had been exposed, did not concede. Dothran was recalled from negotiations. A harder envoy replaced him, a military commander whose armor was thicker and whose grammar carried no grief tones. The fleet's revised position was simple. The original demand stood. The dissident was a traitor whose data was fabricated, and the humans could deliver what was asked or face total harvesting. Negotiations continued for 11 days. I translated every session. The final number landed at 1.8 billion, down from 4 billion, up from 800 million. 1 billion additional human bodies beyond what the engineering required surrendered because a framework built for theology does not retreat to arithmetic. The council announced the agreement using the phrase covenant yield, my phrase. Built from the Thrari grammar, carried into 5 languages and 14 compliance resolutions, and the operational orders that would govern the selection, collection, transportation, and delivery of 1.8 billion human beings to the processing decks of the Butcher fleet. The convoys began 3 weeks after the agreement was signed. Shuttle traffic between Earth's surface and the fleet ran on 18-hour cycles. Bodies lifted from regional collection centers, transferred to the processing ships, and fed into the intake systems I had walked through on my first visit. The conveyor channels scored by prior loads now carried human freight. The cooling racks partitioned into human-sized slots were full. The thermal modeling bays that had projected simulations of human shield architecture now processed real tissue, real bone, real mass, sorted and compressed into the curved sections of a structure that was growing, segment by segment, around a world I would never see. I remained aboard the flagship as the primary translator, because no one else could do the work quickly enough. That was how I phrased it in my reports. It was true. The Thrari intake liturgy required that every shipment be formally received in the blended grammar, each body named, classified, and dedicated before processing. The ritual was mandatory. The fleet's theology held that unblessed material compromised the shield's integrity. Whether that was physics or superstition no longer mattered. The council had accepted the framework, and the framework demanded a priest. I performed the dedications. I stood in the ceremonial bay where I had first met Dothran, reading funerary text over convoy manifests, my pronunciation refined through weeks of daily practice until the tonal clusters came without hesitation. Each manifest listed the dead by mass, origin, age, and thermal classification. Each entry required a compound dedication phrase, the same triple grammar, body fuel offering, spoken over names I could not read because they had been replaced with processing codes. Once, on the 41st day, a manifest loaded incorrectly. For less than a second, before the Thrari system corrected the field, a human name appeared where the processing code should have been. Marisol Alvarez, age 7. Thermal class, low density outer band. Then the name vanished, replaced by a number and a yield category. The liturgy waited. So did the intake corridor. I spoke the dedication over the code because the code was what remained. Garrett was still assigned as security liaison. He observed the dedication ceremonies from the bay's entrance, arms crossed, sidearm holstered. We spoke when logistics required it. He did not ask me how I justified the work. I did not explain. On the 43rd day of processing, I received a short communication through the fleet's internal channel. It was tagged with Dothran's personal cipher, routed from wherever they had reassigned him after his removal from negotiations. The message was a single compound symbol in the ceremonial grammar, one I had seen only once before, carved into the oldest section of the inscription work in the bay's domed ceiling. It meant, roughly, the dead forgive the dead. It could also mean the cost is accepted. It could also mean you are one of us now. I read it 3 times. I set it aside. The next convoy manifest was due in 40 minutes, and the funerary text would not read itself. I walked to the lectern that the Thrari technicians had installed for me at the bay's center, a raised platform positioned so that my voice carried into the intake corridor's acoustic channel, where the processing teams could hear the dedications as they worked. I opened the manifest. I began the first compound phrase, the grief tones Dothran had taught me landing exactly where the ritual placed them. Outside the ship, the white wall advanced. The shield grew. The dead had names that I was no longer permitted to speak, reduced to codes on a manifest, translated through a grammar that made their consumption sacred in 2 languages. I was the bridge the Thrari had needed, a human voice that could carry the weight of the offering in words that both species recognized as prayer. I had given them permission. That was the gift they had crossed the stars for. Every morning, I stood at the lectern and spoke the words. They were beautiful. They were true. The number they blessed was 1 billion lives past what the math had ever required.